The snow fell softly over Maplewood, blanketing the quiet suburban streets in shimmering white. In a small apartment, the faint glow of Christmas lights flickered on a lopsided pine tree, its branches adorned with homemade ornaments and a string of popcorn garlands. The scent of hot cocoa filled the air, the steam rising from two mismatched mugs sitting on the table. But amidst the festive warmth, a question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. How had they come to this moment? A curious little girl sat cross-legged by the tree, clutching a tattered book in one hand and a stuffed bear in the other. She looked up at the man across from her, her bright eyes reflecting both hope and longing. "Do you think it will all be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the snow-dappled window. What had started as a lonely patrol on a cold winter's night had led him here, into a world of promises, heartache, and second chances. Would this Christmas bring the miracle they were all waiting for? Or was hope the only thing holding them together? But before we begin, let us know where you're watching to this story from. Is it cold there? Make sure to stay warm and cozy as you listen to this heartwarming tale. We're sure it will melt your heart. Don't forget to hit subscribe to enjoy more amazing stories like this. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood basked under the warm glow of the setting sun. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and houses painted in pastel hues, each adorned with seasonal wreaths and window boxes of flowers. It was the kind of place where children played safely in front yards, and neighbors greeted each other over white picket fences. For Officer David Hart, however, Maplewood's idyllic charm was little more than a backdrop to his daily patrols. David's cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its engine humming softly. A seasoned police officer with nearly a decade of experience, David had seen it all. The petty crimes, the neighborly disputes, and the occasional emergencies that shattered the town's peaceful facade. But the routine of it all had worn him down. His face, once youthful and full of hope, now bore the weight of countless long shifts and sleepless nights. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, catching sight of his sharp blue eyes that betrayed an undercurrent of loneliness. David was a man of principle, committed to his duty, but years of isolation had built an invisible wall around him. He lived alone in a sparse apartment on the edge of town. The only decorations were a few medals and commendations from his years of service, reminders of a time when he believed his work could make a meaningful difference. The cool night breeze rustled through the empty playground, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Officer David Hart's cruiser rolled past the familiar swings and slides, his headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the desolate park. He had driven this route countless times, but tonight something felt different, a subtle pull that urged him to slow down and take a closer look. As his vehicle crawled to a stop, David's sharp eyes caught sight of a small figure huddled beneath the slide. He squinted, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the faint outline of what looked like a child curled up on the ground sent a jolt through him. David stepped out of the car, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. The figure remained still, seemingly unaware of his approach. His heart quickened as he moved closer, his flashlight illuminating a heartbreaking scene. It was Lena, the same girl he had seen swinging alone earlier that day. She was asleep, curled up on the cold, hard ground beneath the slide. Her knees were tucked to her chest, and she clutched a small, tattered backpack as though it were the only thing in the world she had left. "Lena?" David called out softly, careful not to startle her. The girl stirred, her dark curls shifting slightly as she opened her eyes. For a moment, confusion clouded her face before recognition set in. Her wide, frightened eyes met his, and she instinctively clutched her backpack tighter. "It's okay," David said gently, kneeling down to her level. "It's me, Officer Hart. What are you doing out here, kiddo? It's freezing." Lena blinked, her small body trembling from the cold. I didn't have anywhere else to go," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. David felt a pang of guilt and anger, not at her, but at the world that had left a child in such a vulnerable state. He noticed the faint tear stains on her cheeks and the way her tiny fingers trembled as she tried to pull her thin jacket tighter around herself. "Have you been out here all night?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Lena nodded hesitantly. Not just tonight, she admitted, her gaze dropping to the ground. David's chest tightened. How long, Lena? How long have you been sleeping here? She hesitated, as though trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Finally, she whispered, a few days. Since my mom left. David's breath caught. Your mom? Where did she go? She went to find a job, Lena said, her voice wavering. She said she'd be back soon, but it's been 4 days now. Her words hit David like a punch to the gut. For days. This little girl had been alone, surviving on her own in the cold for 4 whole days. He struggled to keep his emotions in check, knowing that the last thing Lena needed was to see him upset. Did she say where she was going? He asked gently. No, Lena replied, shaking her head, just that she'd come back when she found work. David exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The situation was worse than he had imagined. A child abandoned in a park with no one to look after her. It was the kind of story that made headlines but felt distant until it was staring you in the face. Lena, listen to me, David said, his tone firm yet kind. It's not safe for you to stay here. You could get sick, or worse. I need to take you somewhere warm and safe, okay? Lena hesitated, her small hands gripping her backpack as though it contained her whole world. But what if my mom comes back? She asked, her voice trembling. What if she doesn't find me here? David's heart broke at the fear, and hope mingled in her eyes. We'll make sure she knows where to find you, he assured her. But right now, I need you to trust me. Let's get you somewhere safe first, and then we'll figure everything else out. I promise. Lena stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she nodded, her grip on the backpack loosening slightly. David extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were cold and frail in his warm, steady grip. As they walked to the cruiser, David felt an unfamiliar protective instinct surge within him. He had dealt with vulnerable people before, but something about Lena's quiet strength and fragile demeanor struck a deeper chord. Inside the car, David handed Lena a spare blanket he kept in the back seat. She wrapped it around herself gratefully, her small frame practically disappearing beneath its folds. Are you hungry? He asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She nodded timidly. A little. David made a quick stop at a nearby diner, ordering a warm meal to go. Back at the station, he watched as Lena ate quietly, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. Lena, he said softly, sitting down across from her, I'm going to do everything I can to help you, but I need you to tell me everything you can about your mom. Her name, where you lived before. Anything that might help me find her. Lena looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with both fear and hope. Her name is Maria. We used to live in a small apartment downtown, but we had to leave. Mom said we couldn't afford it anymore. David nodded, jotting down notes as she spoke. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just another case. This was a child who had been left behind, and he couldn't walk away. As Lena finished her meal, David made a silent promise to himself. He would find Maria, no matter how long it took. For the first time in years, David felt a flicker of purpose reignite within him. This wasn't just about duty or protocol. It was about doing what was right, about giving a scared little girl a chance at the life she deserved. The glow of fluorescent lights filled the quiet interior of the Maplewood police station as Officer David Hart led Lena inside. The building, typically bustling with activity during the day, had taken on an almost tranquil silence in the late evening hours. The hum of a distant coffee machine was the only sound breaking the stillness as David guided Lena to his desk. Here we are, David said gently, pulling out a chair for her. Lena perched cautiously on the edge, clutching her tattered backpack like a lifeline. Her wide eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. David could see the tension in her small frame, the way her shoulders hunched and her fingers gripped the frayed straps of her bag. Let's get you comfortable, he said, moving to a nearby cabinet. He returned with a soft blanket, a steaming cup of cocoa from the station's kitchen, and a small packet of crackers. Here, he offered, placing the items in front of her. It's not much, but it'll warm you up. Lena hesitated, her gaze flicking between David and the cup before cautiously taking a sip. A faint smile crossed her lips as the warmth of the cocoa spread through her. David felt a small sense of relief. It was a tiny victory, but it mattered. As she nibbled on the crackers, David settled into his chair across from her, his notepad and pen ready. "Lena, I know this isn't easy," he began, his voice steady and kind. "But I need to know a little more about you and your mom so we can figure out how to help. Can you tell me more about her? What's she like?" Lena's small hands cradled the cup, her eyes lowering as she thought. She's kind," she said softly. "She always tries to make me laugh, even when things are hard. She likes to sing when we're walking places. Sometimes, she sings silly songs just to make me smile." David nodded, encouraging her to continue. "She works really hard," Lena added, her voice growing steadier. "She used to work at a restaurant downtown, but they closed. That's when things got bad. We had to leave our apartment because Mom couldn't pay the rent anymore." David's pen paused mid-stroke as her words sank in. He'd seen cases like this before. Families stretched to the breaking point by circumstances beyond their control. But hearing it directly from Lena gave the story a raw, personal weight. "Where were you staying before you came to the park?" he asked. Lena shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the cup. "We stayed at a shelter for a while, but Mom said it wasn't safe. She said we'd figure it out." David suppressed a sigh, his heart heavy with the realization of just how dire their situation had been. "Did your mom ever say where she was going to look for work?" Lena shook her head. "No, just that she'd find something and come back for me." Her voice trembled, and David noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped the cup. "It's okay," David said gently, leaning forward. "You don't have to remember everything right now. We'll figure this out together." Lena's gaze flickered up to meet his, her dark eyes searching his face. "Do you really think you can find her?" David hesitated, not because he doubted his ability, but because he didn't want to make a promise he couldn't keep. Yet, looking into Lena's hopeful eyes, he knew he couldn't offer anything less. "I promise I'll do everything I can," he said firmly. "We're going to find your mom." A small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of Lena's lips. For the first time, she seemed to relax just slightly, the weight of her ordeal momentarily lifted by his words. As the night wore on, David arranged for Lena to rest in the station's quiet break room, where a small cot had been set up. He brought her a stuffed bear from the station's stash of donated toys, which she clutched tightly as she settled in under the blanket. "Is it okay if I sleep here?" she asked hesitantly, her voice muffled by the bear. "It's more than okay," David reassured her. "You're safe here, Lena. No one will bother you." She nodded, her eyes already heavy with exhaustion. Within minutes, she was asleep, her small frame barely making a dent in the cot. David stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe deeply. His mind raced with thoughts of her story, the hardships she had faced, the resilience she had shown. Returning to his desk, David picked up his phone and began making calls. He contacted local shelters, hospitals, and even nearby diners, hoping for any lead on Maria, Lena's mother. Each call brought the same frustrating response. No one matching her description had been seen. The clock ticked past midnight, but David refused to give up. His notepad filled with scribbled notes, ideas for places to check, and questions to ask. With each call, his resolve deepened. As he worked, David found himself thinking about his own childhood. He had grown up in a stable home, with parents who had always been there for him. The thought of a child like Lena facing the world alone was unbearable. When the station finally quieted for the night, David returned to check on Lena one last time. She was still fast asleep, the stuffed bear tucked under her chin. "Don't worry, kiddo," he whispered softly, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to find her. I promise." For the first time in years, David felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the badge on his chest. This wasn't just about following protocol. It was about doing what was right, about giving a little girl hope in a world that had taken too much from her. As he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, David couldn't help but feel that Lena had already started to change him. In her quiet strength, he saw a reflection of the man he wanted to be, someone who didn't just enforce the law but made a real difference in people's lives. The sun rose over Maplewood, casting a soft golden light across the quiet streets as Officer David Hart sat at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The station had come alive with the usual morning bustle, but David's focus remained solely on the notepad before him. Scrawled across its pages were fragmented clues about Lena's mother, Maria, a name, a handful of vague details, and a face that lingered in his memory from Lena's descriptions. David tapped his pen against the desk, his thoughts racing. The responsibility of finding Maria weighed heavily on him, and the sense of urgency only grew each time he thought about Lena's hopeful face. He knew the clock was ticking. The longer Maria remained missing, the harder it would be to piece together her trail. Taking a deep breath, David reached for the phone and began dialing. His first call was to the local homeless shelter Lena had mentioned. After identifying himself and explaining the situation, he waited as the receptionist sifted through their records. "I'm sorry, Officer Hart," she said finally. "We don't have anyone by that name in our system, and no one matching her description has stayed here recently." David thanked her and hung up, jotting down another dead end in his notes. He moved on to the next lead, contacting local diners and cafes where Maria might have looked for work. "No, sorry," one manager said apologetically after David described Maria. "We haven't had anyone like that apply here." It was the same story at every place he called. No one had seen or heard of Maria. Frustration began to creep in, but David forced himself to remain calm. Giving up wasn't an option. By mid-morning, David decided to broaden his search. He contacted hospitals in neighboring towns, explaining that Maria might have been involved in an accident or sought medical attention. At the third hospital he called, a nurse hesitated before responding. "We did admit a woman matching that description a few days ago," she said. "She was in a car accident and was brought in unconscious. Let me check her records." David's heart raced as he waited on the line, his grip tightening on the receiver. The nurse returned moments later with an update. "Her name isn't Maria," she clarified, "but it might still be the person you're looking for. She's listed as a Jane Doe because we couldn't locate any next of kin. She's in stable condition but still unconscious." David scribbled down the hospital's information and thanked the nurse. A spark of hope ignited within him, tempered by uncertainty. If this woman was Maria, it could explain why she hadn't returned for Lena. But what if it wasn't her? As he prepared to visit the hospital, David glanced at the clock and realized he had promised to check on Lena. Before heading out, he stopped by the break room where Lena was quietly coloring with a set of crayons one of his colleagues had brought her. "Hey, Lena," he said, crouching beside her. "How are you doing?" Lena looked up, her small smile faltering. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice laced with hope and fear. David hesitated. He didn't want to raise her expectations prematurely, but he also didn't want to dismiss the possibility. "I might have a lead," he said carefully. "There's someone I need to check on at the hospital. It could be your mom." Lena's eyes widened, and she set down her crayon. "Really? You think it's her?" David nodded, his voice steady. "I'm going to find out. But no matter what, I promise I won't stop looking until we find her." Lena's smile returned, brighter this time. "Thank you, Officer Hart," she said softly. David's chest tightened as he looked at her. There was a quiet strength in Lena that both inspired and humbled him. Her unwavering belief in her mother's return reminded him of the importance of hope, even in the face of uncertainty. Arriving at the hospital an hour later, David felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. As he approached the front desk, he introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit. The nurse directed him to a room on the third floor, and David's footsteps echoed in the sterile hallway as he made his way there. When he finally stood outside the room, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find. Inside, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines. On the bed lay a woman with dark hair, her face pale and bruised but still bearing a resemblance to the description Lena had given him. David studied her features carefully, searching for the familiar warmth Lena had described. "Is it her?" David whispered to himself, unsure. The nurse who had assisted him earlier entered the room, breaking his reverie. "Is she the person you're looking for?" she asked gently. David shook his head. I'm not sure yet. She looks like Lena's description, but the nurse nodded. You're welcome to stay and try to confirm. We're hopeful she'll regain consciousness soon. David thanked her, his gaze returning to the woman. Sitting down in the chair beside her bed, he found himself thinking about Lena again. Her resilience in the face of adversity, her ability to hold on to hope despite everything. These qualities had begun to stir something in David he hadn't felt in years. The case wasn't just another assignment anymore. It had become personal, a mission driven by something deeper than duty. As he sat there, watching over the woman who might be Lena's mother, David made another silent promise. No matter how long it took, no matter how many obstacles he faced, he wouldn't stop until he reunited Lena with her mom. The search was far from over, but for the first time, David felt the faintest glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. The sterile hum of the hospital room was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Officer David Hart sat in the stiff chair beside the hospital bed, his gaze fixed on the woman lying unconscious before him. Her face, though bruised and pale, held an unmistakable familiarity. David had spent the past few hours piecing together the clues, but now, staring at her, his breath caught in his chest. The shape of her face, the curve of her cheekbones, the faint scar on her forehead, it was all achingly familiar. Memories, long buried under the weight of years, came rushing back like a flood. Maria? He whispered, though he knew that wasn't her name. The name in her medical records confirmed what he hadn't dared to believe. It wasn't Maria after all, but Nicole Callahan, his high school sweetheart. David leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He hadn't seen Nicole in nearly 15 years, not since the summer after their senior year when life had pulled them in separate directions. She had been his first love, the girl who made him believe in forever. But forever had ended far too soon, and they had lost touch as college, careers, and life's complexities took over. What are the odds? He muttered to himself, running a hand over his face. He glanced again at her, as if looking longer might provide answers. Her face, though marked by the trauma of the accident, still bore traces of the vibrant young woman he had known. She had always been strong, determined, and full of life. What had brought her to this moment? His thoughts turned to Lena, the brave, resilient girl who had been waiting in that playground, clutching a hope that her mother would return. He hadn't yet told Lena the details, not until he was sure. But now, staring at Nicole, he knew there was no doubt. "Nicole," he said softly, leaning forward, "what happened to you? And why didn't you have anyone to call? How did things get this bad?" The nurse entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. She smiled kindly as she checked the monitors and made notes on the chart. "She's stable," the nurse said, glancing at David. "Her injuries are serious but not life-threatening. It's likely the coma is her body's way of healing. We're hopeful she'll wake up soon." David nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate all you're doing for her." The nurse hesitated, sensing his emotional connection to the patient. "Do you know her well?" David hesitated before answering. "I did a long time ago." The nurse offered a sympathetic smile before leaving the room, leaving David alone with his thoughts once more. As he sat there, memories of Nicole played like a film reel in his mind. Late-night drives with the windows down, shared laughter over ice cream, promises made under starlit skies. They had dreamed of a life together, but reality had intervened. Now, all these years later, their paths had crossed again under unimaginable circumstances. David's thoughts turned back to Lena. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The girl's quiet strength, her unwavering hope. She had Nicole's eyes. "I should have known," he muttered, shaking his head. The realization that Lena was Nicole's daughter stirred a protective instinct in him that was both familiar and new. He had made a promise to Lena, and now that promise extended to Nicole. He couldn't let her face this alone. Leaning forward, David took Nicole's hand gently in his own. Her skin was cold but steady, her pulse a quiet reassurance beneath his fingers. "Nicole," he said softly, "I don't know if you can hear me, but Lena's safe. She's waiting for you, and I promised her I'd bring you back. So you've got to wake up, okay? She needs you." The sound of his own voice surprised him. It was filled with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As the hours passed, David found himself drawn deeper into the gravity of the situation. He thought about the life Nicole and Lena must have lived, the struggles, the sacrifices. He thought about what it meant for a woman like Nicole, who had once been so full of fire, to end up in a hospital bed with no one to call. When he finally left the hospital that evening, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He drove directly to the station, where Lena was waiting with her social worker. "Officer Hart," Lena called, her face lighting up as he entered. David crouched to meet her, his heart aching at her hopeful smile. "Did you find her?" Lena asked eagerly. David nodded, his voice steady. "I did. Your mom's in the hospital, but she's safe. She had an accident, which is why she couldn't come back to you. But the doctors are taking good care of her." Lena's eyes filled with tears, a mix of relief and worry. "Can I see her?" "Not just yet," David said gently. "She needs to rest and get stronger first. But I promise, as soon as she's ready, I'll take you to her." Lena nodded bravely, her small hands clutching the stuffed bear David had given her days before. As he watched her, David felt a surge of determination. This was no longer just a case. It was personal. Nicole and Lena needed him, and he wouldn't let them down. Later that night, as he sat at his desk, David began planning his next steps. He would find a way to ensure Lena was cared for while Nicole recovered. He would help them rebuild their lives, no matter what it took. For the first time in years, David felt his heart begin to thaw. Nicole and Lena had awakened something in him he thought he had lost, a sense of connection, of purpose, of hope. And as he stared at the photograph Lena had drawn of her and her mother, he silently vowed to protect the little family he had found himself a part of. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Officer David Hart. Between his shifts at the station and his frequent visits to the hospital, he found himself navigating a delicate balance of duty and personal connection. Each evening, he made time to visit Lena, now temporarily staying in a safe foster home arranged by social services. The foster home was modest but warm, with a small garden in the front yard and colorful drawings tacked to the walls inside. It was clear the couple running it cared deeply for the children they hosted, but even so, Lena always seemed to brighten whenever David walked through the door. "Officer Hart." Lena greeted him one afternoon, her face lighting up with a smile as she ran to him, clutching a drawing she had been working on. David crouched down to her level, smiling as she handed him the paper. It was a crayon sketch of a tall man, a little girl, and a woman, all holding hands beneath a shining sun. "It's us," Lena explained, her voice soft but proud. "You, me, and Mom, when we're all together again." David felt his chest tighten as he studied the drawing. The childlike hope in her artwork was a poignant reminder of the stakes he was working for. "It's beautiful, Lena," he said, tucking the paper carefully into his pocket. "I'm going to keep this with me." Over time, their visits became a routine. David would sit with Lena in the cozy living room or out in the garden, listening as she talked about her mother. "Mom loves sunflowers," Lena said one afternoon, her legs swinging off the edge of the porch swing. "She says they remind her of the summers when she was little." David smiled, picturing Nicole's face light up as she shared such a simple joy. "She's right," he said. "Sunflowers are beautiful, just like you and your mom." Lena beamed at the compliment, her small hands clutching the edge of the swing. "Do you think she misses me?" David felt a pang of sadness, but answered without hesitation. "I know she does, Lena. She loves you more than anything. That's why she worked so hard, to make sure you were okay." Lena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, when it's really quiet at night, I think I can hear her singing." "It's silly, I know." "It's not silly," David interrupted gently. "Sometimes, holding on to those memories can make us feel closer to the people we love." Their conversations always left David with a sense of renewed purpose. The more Lena shared about her mother, stories of her singing lullabies, braiding her hair, or packing their meager belongings for yet another move, the more determined David became to reunite them. At the hospital, David kept a steady vigil by Nicole's bedside. Though she remained unconscious, Her vitals continued to improve, and the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. On one particular evening, David brought a bouquet of sunflowers to brighten the room. As he placed them on the windowsill, he couldn't help but imagine how Nicole would react when she woke up to see them and to learn that Lena was safe. Sitting beside her, David spoke softly, recounting his days with Lena. "She's amazing, Nicole," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Strong, smart, and so full of hope. She talks about you all the time. You're her world." He paused, his gaze fixed on her still form. "I've made a promise to her, and to you. I'm going to bring you two back together, whatever it takes." The weight of his words settled heavily on him. David knew this wasn't just about fulfilling a duty anymore. It had become personal. Back at the station, David's colleagues began to notice the change in him. The once stoic and reserved officer now carried a lighter energy, often seen scribbling notes or making phone calls on behalf of Lena and Nicole. "You're really invested in this case, huh?" Officer Martinez remarked one afternoon, leaning against David's desk. David glanced up from his paperwork and nodded. "It's more than a case," he admitted. "They need someone, and I can't turn my back on them." Martinez studied him for a moment before nodding. "You've got a good heart, Hart," she said with a smirk. "Who knew?" David chuckled softly, grateful for the support. As weeks turned into a month, David's bond with Lena deepened. She grew more comfortable around him, often laughing at his silly jokes or asking him to tell stories about his own childhood. "Did you have a mom and dad like mine?" she asked one evening as they worked on a puzzle together. "I did," David replied, his tone warm. "They were good people. My dad was strict, but he always made time to play catch with me. And my mom? She made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world." Lena giggled. "I bet my mom makes better cookies." David grinned. "I'd love to try them someday." The quiet moments with Lena became the highlight of David's days. She had a way of reminding him what really mattered in life: connection, compassion, and the simple act of showing up for someone in need. One afternoon, as David prepared to leave the foster home, Lena tugged at his sleeve. "Officer Hart?" "Yes, Lena." "Thank you," she said, her voice small but sincere, "for helping me and for believing in Mom. I don't feel so scared anymore." David crouched down, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to thank me, Lena. You and your mom. You've already given me more than you know." As he drove away, David reflected on how much his life had changed since the night he found Lena in the playground. What had started as a routine patrol had become a journey of rediscovery, not just for Lena and Nicole, but for himself. David had always seen himself as a protector, but for the first time, he realized he could also be a builder, someone who helped piece together broken lives, one small act of kindness at a time. And as he glanced at the drawing Lena had given him, now framed and sitting on the dashboard of his cruiser, David knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of Nicole's hospital room, casting a warm glow on the pale walls. Officer David Hart sat in the chair by her bedside, the hum of the machines around him a constant backdrop. He had spent the past few weeks here, dividing his time between his duties at the station, his visits to Lena, and his silent vigils at Nicole's side. Today felt different. David noticed subtle changes, the slight movement of Nicole's fingers, the flutter of her eyelids. He leaned forward, hope surging through him. "Nicole?" he said softly, his voice a gentle nudge against the stillness. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, before settling on him. There was confusion in her gaze, a quiet wariness as she tried to piece together where she was and who he might be. "It's okay," David reassured her, his voice steady and kind. "You're safe. You've been in an accident, but you're going to be fine." Nicole blinked slowly, her lips parting as if to speak. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse and barely audible. Where am I?" "You're in Maplewood General Hospital," David explained. "You've been here for a few weeks now. You've had a lot of people looking out for you." Nicole's eyes darted around the room, as though searching for something or someone. When her gaze returned to David, there was a flicker of recognition. I know you," she murmured, her voice trembling. David smiled faintly. It's been a long time, Nicole. Her brows furrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. David Hart, from high school? That's me, he said, nodding. We'll catch up later, but first, there's someone very important waiting to see you. Nicole's eyes widened, a sudden urgency overtaking her. Lena, where's my daughter? Is she okay? She's safe, David assured her quickly. She's been waiting for you. She never stopped believing you'd come back. Nicole's shoulders sagged with relief, tears welling in her eyes. I need to see her. Please, can you bring her to me? David nodded. I'll bring her right away. Just rest, okay? She's going to be so happy to see you. David's drive to Lena's foster home was filled with anticipation. He could barely keep his thoughts straight, imagining how the reunion would unfold. By the time he arrived, Lena was waiting for him in the front yard, her small face lighting up the moment she saw his cruiser pull into the driveway. Officer Hart, she called, running to meet him. David crouched to meet her, his hands steadying her shoulders. Lena, he said, his voice filled with warmth, I have the best news. Your mom is awake. Lena's eyes widened, and for a moment, she stood frozen in disbelief. She's awake? David nodded, smiling. She's asking for you. She can't wait to see you. Tears welled in Lena's eyes as she threw her arms around David's neck. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Let's go see her, David said, his own voice thick with feeling. When they arrived at the hospital, Lena clutched David's hand tightly as they made their way to Nicole's room. Her small steps slowed as they reached the door, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her expression. What if she doesn't recognize me? Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David knelt beside her, looking into her wide, uncertain eyes. She's been waiting for this moment as much as you have, he said gently. She loves you more than anything, Lena. You're her whole world. Lena nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. David pushed the door open slowly, revealing Nicole sitting up in bed, her face pale but filled with hope. When her eyes landed on Lena, fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. Lena, Nicole whispered, her voice breaking. Mommy, Lena cried, running to her. In an instant, Lena climbed onto the bed, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother. Nicole held her just as fiercely, their tears mingling as they clung to each other. I missed you so much, sweetheart, Nicole sobbed, stroking Lena's dark curls. I'm so sorry I couldn't come back sooner. I love you more than anything. Lena buried her face in Nicole's shoulder, her small body shaking with emotion. I knew you'd come back, she said between sobs. I never stopped believing. David stood quietly by the door, his throat tightening as he watched the reunion unfold. It was a moment of pure love and relief, a bond between mother and daughter rekindled after weeks of uncertainty. As Nicole whispered words of comfort to Lena, David felt a surge of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge fully. This little family, broken and scattered, had found their way back to each other, and he had been a part of that journey. Nicole looked up at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Thank you, David, she said softly, for everything. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. David shook his head, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You don't need to. Seeing you two together is more than enough. Later that evening, as David drove back to the station, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The strict, stoic officer he had once been seemed like a distant memory. Lena and Nicole had shown him the power of hope, love, and connection, reminding him of the reasons he had become a police officer in the first place. They had given him more than just a sense of purpose. They had reignited his belief in humanity, in second chances, and in the resilience of the human spirit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David realized that his role in their lives was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt truly connected to something bigger than himself. And as he reached into his pocket, pulling out Lena's drawing of their little family, he couldn't help but smile. The soft hum of activity filled the cozy two-bedroom apartment as volunteers carried boxes through the door. The space, though modest, felt warm and inviting with its freshly painted walls and sunlight streaming through the windows. Officer David Hart stood in the living room, watching as the community came together to help Nicole and Lena start over. The transformation had been swift but heartfelt. After Nicole was discharged from the hospital, David had immediately set to work finding a safe place for her and Lena to call home. Word of their story had spread throughout Maplewood, and the response had been overwhelming. A local landlord offered a reduced rent on a small but charming apartment, and neighbors rallied together to furnish it. People donated everything from kitchen supplies to gently used furniture, each item a symbol of compassion and solidarity. "Officer Hart, where should we put this?" a cheerful voice called out, snapping David out of his thoughts. He turned to see Mrs. Johnson, the kind-hearted owner of the bakery down the street, holding a box labeled "Dishes." "Right over there on the counter," David replied, smiling. As Mrs. Johnson set the box down, she looked around the room, her face glowing with satisfaction. "It's amazing what we can do when we all pitch in," she said warmly. David nodded. "It really is. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Johnson. I don't know what we'd do without you." She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nonsense. It's the least we can do. That little girl deserves a fresh start." Nearby, Lena was sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully unpacking a box of books. She had a look of wonder on her face as she flipped through the pages of a brightly illustrated storybook. "Mom, look!" she exclaimed, holding up the book for Nicole to see. Nicole, still moving gingerly as she recovered from her injuries, smiled from where she was organizing the pantry. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Why don't you pick a spot on the shelf for your books?" Lena nodded eagerly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. David watched the interaction, his chest tightening with emotion. Seeing Nicole and Lena in this moment, safe, happy, and together, felt like a victory. Later that afternoon, as the last of the boxes were unpacked, the apartment began to take shape. A plush couch sat against one wall. A coffee table with a vase of sunflowers in the center stood proudly in the living room, and colorful curtains adorned the windows. The kitchen was stocked with donated groceries, and Lena's bedroom had been transformed into a little girl's dream, complete with a bed covered in a quilt of pastel butterflies and a small desk where she could draw and do homework. "This is perfect," Nicole said softly, standing beside David as she took it all in. Her voice was thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank everyone for this." David glanced at her, his expression gentle. "You don't have to. You and Lena deserve this fresh start. Everyone just wanted to help." Nicole nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've done so much for us, David. More than I could ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," David replied, his voice steady. "I'm just glad to see you both safe and happy." That evening, the volunteers gathered in the living room for a small celebration. A potluck-style dinner had been arranged, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie. Laughter and chatter echoed through the apartment as people shared stories and toasted to new beginnings. Lena sat beside David at the dining table, her cheeks rosy with excitement as she recounted her favorite books and the colors she wanted to paint the walls of her room. "Maybe purple," she mused, looking up at David. "Or yellow, like the sunflowers." David chuckled. "Both sound like great choices. Maybe we can paint it together sometime." Lena's face lit up at the suggestion. "Really? You'd help me?" "Of course," David said, smiling. Nicole, sitting across from them, watched the exchange with a soft expression. She had noticed how easily Lena had bonded with David and how much he had come to mean to both of them. "David," Nicole said after a moment, her voice cutting through the lively chatter. He looked up, his attention shifting to her. "Yeah, I just want to say," Nicole hesitated, searching for the right words. "You've become such an important part of our lives. I don't think we could have made it through this without you." David felt his throat tighten. He glanced at Lena, who was nodding emphatically, then back at Nicole. "It's been my honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You two have given me more than you know." As the evening wound down and the last of the volunteers left, the apartment grew quiet. David stayed behind to help clean up, though Nicole protested that he had already done enough. After the dishes were washed and the counters wiped down, David found Lena sitting on the couch, her eyes growing heavy with sleep. He scooped her up gently, carrying her to her new bed. "Good night, Lena," he said softly, tucking her in. "Good night, Officer Hart," she murmured, her voice drowsy. "I mean good night, David." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face before stepping out of the room. Nicole was waiting in the living room, a cup of tea in her hands. She offered one to David, and they sat together on the couch, the warmth of the tea and the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. "This feels like the start of something new," Nicole said softly, her gaze distant but hopeful. "It is," David agreed. "For both of you." "And for you?" she asked, her eyes searching his. David hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, for me too." As they sat together in the glow of the lamplight, David felt a profound sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't just doing his job. He was part of something bigger. This little family, once fractured and lost, had found its way back together. And David, in helping them, had found a home of his own. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of Nicole and Lena's new life began to settle. The modest apartment grew more vibrant with each passing day, filled with laughter, the aroma of home-cooked meals, and the comforting presence of a newfound family. Officer David Hart had become an integral part of their lives, visiting often to lend a hand, share a meal, or simply spend time with Lena. It was on one of these visits, while helping Lena with her homework, that the little girl dropped a question that stopped David in his tracks. "David," Lena said, her pencil hovering above her notebook. "Yeah, kiddo," he replied, glancing up from the math problem they were working on. Can I call you Dad?" she asked hesitantly, her dark eyes wide with hope. David's breath caught in his chest. He set his pencil down, the weight of her words pressing on him. For a moment, he struggled to find the right response, overwhelmed by the depth of her question. "Lena," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "You can call me whatever feels right to you." A smile broke across her face, shy but filled with joy. "Okay, Dad," she said, the word tentative but warm. David felt his heart swell, his throat tightening with emotion. "It's an honor," he said, his voice steady but thick. From that day forward, Lena began calling him Dad more often, each time with a little more confidence. For David, the word carried a significance he hadn't anticipated. It was more than a title. It was a bond, a role he hadn't realized he was ready to embrace. Nicole noticed the change, her heart softening as she watched the bond between David and her daughter deepen. One evening, as she and David sat together on the couch after dinner, she broached the topic. "You're really good with her," Nicole said, her voice quiet but sincere. David looked over at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She makes it easy," he replied. Nicole studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You've become such an important part of her life, of both our lives." David met her eyes, his expression earnest. "You and Lena have done just as much for me. I didn't realize how much I was missing until you two came along." Nicole's lips curved into a soft smile. "Well, we're glad you're here." As December approached, the chill in the air was accompanied by the festive spirit of the holiday season. For Lena, it was an opportunity to experience the kind of Christmas she hadn't had in years. "We need a tree," Lena announced one evening, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "A tree, huh?" David said, raising an eyebrow. "You've got big plans, don't you?" Lena nodded eagerly. "Mom and I used to make decorations together. Can we do that again?" Nicole laughed softly, her expression warm. "Of course we can, sweetheart. Let's make this Christmas special." A few days later, the trio ventured to a local tree lot, where Lena ran from tree to tree, examining each one with the critical eye of a seasoned decorator. "This one," she finally declared, pointing to a tall, slightly lopsided pine. David chuckled. "You sure? It's a little crooked." "It's perfect," Lena insisted, her hands on her hips. David exchanged a glance with Nicole, who shrugged with a smile. "She knows what she wants," she said. Back at the apartment, they set up the tree in the corner of the living room. Lena and Nicole worked on homemade decorations, cutting out paper snowflakes and stringing popcorn garlands, while David wrestled with a strand of tangled lights. "Do these things come pre-knotted? Or is it just me?" he muttered, earning a laugh from Nicole. By the time they finished, the tree stood proudly, its branches adorned with colorful, mismatched ornaments that glimmered in the warm glow of the lights. "It's beautiful," Lena said, her voice filled with wonder as she stared at their creation. "It's perfect," Nicole agreed, pulling Lena into a hug. David stood back, his hands on his hips, a satisfied smile on his face. "We make a pretty good team," he said. On Christmas morning, Lena woke early, bounding into the living room to find a small pile of presents under the tree. David and Nicole joined her shortly after, both holding mugs of steaming coffee. As Lena tore into the wrapping paper, her delighted squeals filled the room. Each gift, a set of art supplies, a cozy scarf, a new storybook, was met with wide-eyed excitement. Thank you," she said, hugging both David and Nicole tightly. But it was the final gift that left her speechless, a framed photograph of the three of them, taken at the park a few weeks earlier. Beneath the photo, in Lena's handwriting, were the words, "My family." Lena's eyes welled with tears as she held the frame close. "This is the best Christmas ever," she said softly. David felt his own eyes sting as he looked at her, then at Nicole, whose expression mirrored his emotions. "It's the best for us too," Nicole said, her voice thick with emotion. As the day wore on, the apartment filled with the aroma of roasted turkey and spiced apple cider. Friends and neighbors stopped by to share in the celebration, bringing food, gifts, and well wishes. The warmth and love in the room were palpable, a testament to the community that had rallied around Nicole and Lena. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down and the guests began to leave, David found himself sitting by the tree, watching as Lena drifted off to sleep in Nicole's lap. Nicole looked over at him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You've given us so much, David. I don't think we'd be here without you." David shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've given me more than I ever expected," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed this. A family, a sense of belonging." Nicole reached out, placing her hand over his. "Well, you're stuck with us now," she said with a teasing smile. David chuckled, but his voice was earnest as he replied, "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the lights on the tree twinkled and the quiet of the evening settled around them, David felt a profound sense of peace. He had found a family he hadn't been searching for but desperately needed. A bond forged through compassion, love, and second chances. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Spring arrived in Maplewood with its usual vibrance, the town blooming with new life. The once muted colors of winter gave way to bright greens and bursts of flowers in every garden. For Officer David Hart, it felt as if the season mirrored the transformation in his own life. Months had passed since Nicole and Lena had moved into their new home, and life for the little family had begun to stabilize. Nicole had fully recovered from her injuries and started working part-time at a nearby library, a job that allowed her to balance work while spending quality time with Lena. The apartment had truly become a home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet rhythms of daily life. David, too, had settled into his role within their lives, not as a visitor or a helper, but as family. His evenings were often spent at their apartment, helping Lena with her homework, sharing dinners with Nicole, or simply sitting on the couch, enjoying the comfort of their company. One Saturday afternoon, Lena stood in the garden with David, a small spade in her hand as she helped plant sunflower seeds. "Mom says these will grow really tall," Lena said, her voice bright with excitement. "Like, taller than me." "They will if we take good care of them," David replied, gently patting the soil around a seed. "Do you think they'll be as pretty as the ones you brought to Mom in the hospital?" Lena asked, looking up at him. David smiled. "I think they'll be even prettier, because you planted them." Lena grinned, wiping her hands on her overalls. "I can't wait to see them grow." Nicole watched from the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. The sight of David and Lena together filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. David had become more than just a figure in their lives. He was a source of strength, joy, and unwavering support. The following week, Nicole organized a small gathering to celebrate Lena's birthday. It was a simple affair, a few neighbors, a homemade cake, and colorful decorations that Lena had helped hang. As Lena blew out the candles, she glanced at David, her eyes shining with happiness. "Did you make a wish?" David asked, leaning closer. Lena nodded, a mischievous smile spreading across her face. "But I can't tell you, or it won't come true." David chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Fair enough, but I have a feeling your wish might already be coming true." Nicole watched the exchange with a soft smile. Later, as they cleaned up the party together, she turned to David. "You've changed her life," she said quietly. David paused, the stack of plates in his hands momentarily forgotten. "She's changed mine too," he admitted. "Both of you have." Nicole reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've given us more than we ever could have asked for. You've given Lena a father." David felt a lump form in his throat. He set the plates down and met Nicole's gaze. "And you've given me a family," he said sincerely. As summer approached, the trio celebrated small milestones that felt monumental in their own way. Lena earned a certificate for her artwork at school, and David made sure to frame it and hang it prominently in their living room. Nicole baked her first apple pie in years, a recipe her mother had taught her, and it quickly became a family favorite. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the station, David arrived at the apartment to find Lena waiting on the porch with a book in her hands. "David, can you read to me tonight?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "Of course," he said, scooping her up in his arms and carrying her inside. Later, as Lena drifted off to sleep, Nicole joined David in the living room. "She's so happy," Nicole said, her voice soft with contentment. David nodded. "She deserves to be." Nicole hesitated before speaking again. "You know, when I woke up in the hospital and saw you there, I didn't know what to expect. But now, I can't imagine our lives without you." David turned to her, his expression warm. "Neither can I." The seasons continued to pass, and with each one, the bond between David, Nicole, and Lena grew stronger. They became a family in every sense of the word, celebrating birthdays, holidays, and the simple joys of everyday life together. David often found himself reflecting on how far they had all come. He thought back to the lonely nights patrolling the quiet streets of Maplewood, his life devoid of connection or purpose beyond his badge. Meeting Lena had changed everything. Her unwavering hope, her resilience, and her trust had reignited a part of him he thought was lost. Nicole, too, had given him something he hadn't realized he needed. A partner, someone who understood his fears and shared his dreams. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, David turned to Nicole and said, "I never thought this was possible. A life like this. A family." Nicole smiled, reaching for his hand. "Sometimes, life surprises you," she said. Lena appeared behind them, holding a plate of cookies she had proudly baked with Nicole's help. "Are we having a family meeting?" she asked, plopping down between them. David chuckled. "Something like that." "Well, I think we're the best family ever," Lena declared, taking a bite of her cookie. David and Nicole exchanged a glance, their hearts full. As the stars began to twinkle above, David reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a chance encounter on a quiet night in Maplewood had become the foundation for a new life, one filled with love, connection, and purpose. He had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for, a family. And in doing so, he had rediscovered himself. Looking at Nicole and Lena, David knew that they had come full circle. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, together. And for the first time in his life, David felt complete. Our story has come to an end. Thank you for listening until the very end, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to motivate us to bring you more exciting stories.